Chapter 13. Dangers Far and Near. Pent 2. Mid-1860s. Worth his salt. To be worth one's pay. He wasn't worth his salt as a soldier. The American Civil War lasted 4 years, from April 1861 until April 1865, when on the 14th of April, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and died the next day. What had started at Fort Sumter in South Carolina ended near the Mexican border in Texas. Although the war was over by some measure, the aftershocks of it continued for a couple of decades and beyond. The bloodiest battle was Gettysburg, where over 50,000 soldiers perished. More than 620,000 men died in the 4 years of conflict. Needless to say, the number of younger men was significantly reduced by the war. Widows made by the war and other causes made it hard for a woman with children to find an acceptable new mate. It is estimated that the war created 200,000 white widows within 4 years. While no battles or skirmishes came to Bear Creek and only brief skirmishes to Searcy County area, the effects of a nation at war affected all people living in the South for the next couple of decades following. The war caused economic, social, and spiritual retardation that held on until most of that generation passed. The divide between the North and South healed, but very slowly. Hate and resentment ran deep in Southerners during and after the war. The fighting between soldiers ceased, but not the feuding and violence of those who were still looking for opportunity to draw blood and steal from the defenseless. Terrorists, known as bushwhackers, would roam throughout the hills when the armies were gone. Jenny and her 2 little boys, Mart and Billy, remained on the farmstead where Ellis had started his family before the war. The Homestead Act of 1862 came later, and I suppose their farm was land that they had acquired or just squatted on. Ellis's death came just about a year before the war started, and Jenny decided to stay and eke out a living in the hollow where their cabin stood. To Jenny, it must have seemed that every hardship that could be thrown at her was hanging over her head. It was customary for a widow to wear mourning garb to let all know that her black attire was to signify her loss. Jenny couldn't afford, nor did she have time to wear formal attire, but perhaps she had a black bonnet or scarf to display her grief. Some women simply dyed their existing clothes black to express their loss. Sentiments were expressed by the public to the host of women who were bereft of a husband or son. Over the next decade, many left the Ozarks region to go where they felt safer, looking for new opportunities. There would have been less effects of the war by going west or by going north, beyond the border states. To the south, many fled into Texas, where it was safer for slaves and slave owners in the broad plains away from the Mississippi River and its ocean gulf. Kansas was hit by a severe drought, causing over 30,000 people leave it in 1861. The poor soil conditions of the hills contributed to migrations into new lands as well. The war had also created an 80% inflation rate. Credit was next to impossible to acquire, and most folks living in the region had no money. Bartering was the only way for many to get the necessities they needed. Jenny had no place of refuge in which to flee, even if she wanted to. Her origin of Tennessee was a hot spot during the conflict, and its conditions were no better. Trying to escape to the east would have been very risky, so she just stayed put. When President Lincoln issued a call for troops, Arkansas seceded from the Union and joined the southern states' newly formed Confederacy. Men in Searcy County were divided about their loyalty, as some sympathized and supported the Union, but most sided with the Confederacy. As with other states that were caught in the middle, brother fought brother, and on a larger scale, fellow Americans will fight each other. Staying put in her Ozarks holler with a few members of her family made the most sense. But the hardships were long and severe. The average American needed about 50 pounds of salt annually, of which most was used for preserving food. Salted pork was a mainstay for those like Jenny, who needed it to preserve the meat when they slaughtered. The Union Army cut off all salt supplies to the South, and the result was shortage and inflation, causing a salt famine. Many were forced to conserving and reclaiming it. Some took the dirt from beneath the racks of their meat house and leached it for its salt. Less salt meant that the pork had to be consumed by early spring before the rising temperatures spoiled it. Only fresh meat could be had if it could be found. Maybe Jenny took the boys and went fishing in Bear Creek for some meat when they had time. My guess is that Jenny had very little salt during the war. Before the war, oxen-driven wagons traveled from Yellville to Springfield, Missouri, to haul back the heavy freight. Salt was sold by the bushel and had been supplied from sources back east on the Union side of the line. That suddenly stopped when salt was restricted to the Confederate States. Local trading posts on Bear Creek had no salt to offer traders, and luxuries like coffee, sugar, tea, or hard candy were out of supply and affordability to the poor. If anything was given as a gift at Christmas, it was a necessity, like knitted socks or underwear. It was a paradox, living in the hills which were rich in resources but cash poor. Hard times have a way of improving us. We learn to appreciate extra things and how to work around problems. Jenny knew how to improvise and fix worn-out things. Clothing was patched and repatched to keep it in service. Animal hide could repair shoes and other leather products. Jenny was reduced to sheer poverty, but not reduced to defeat. She worked at making the most from the things she had. Many things were made from the abundance of wood carved and shaped to fit the need. Metal required a blacksmith, and that was expensive. Wood implements were made for the field and the kitchen. A sharp axe and knife were essentials for the pioneers to cut their living out of the rugged hills. Another form of salt that had become popular before the war was found and mined in the hills. During the war, the Confederate Niter and Mining Bureau used civilians to provide the Confederate States of America with much-needed copper, iron, lead, sulfur, zinc, and saltpeter. Saltpeter was briefly mined from caves in the Ozarks. When manure from bats living in a dry cave mixes with the calcium of the limestone, the nitrogen combines to make a nitrocalcite, which can be made into gunpowder, yet the saltpeter had to be extracted from the dirt. Bat manure is high in nitrogen, about 16%, and was taken from caves immersed in water, heated, then filtered when the crystals collected on the bottom. At the time, the standardized mixture for gunpowder consisted of 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% elemental sulfur. One way that men could avoid being conscripted into the war was to work in the caves making niter. It was stinky work, and most men didn't like doing it. A deserter who was found might have been made to work the stinky niter caves. In the end, very little of the much-needed niter came from the Ozarks. But Texas mining eventually became the primary source in the South. The demand for gunpowder and lead made for a shortage for those who could hunt or needed to protect themselves. The term bleeding like a stuck hog or squealing like a stuck hog was the result of a knife being used to kill a hog. This ancient method of butchering didn't require using powder or lead. The stab to the hog's throat made the pig kill over from loss of blood. If Jenny had a hound dog, the blood would be lapped up for a meal, but it was typical to use it to make blood sausage. Most American immigrants came from cultures that made it in a variety of ways. Killing a hog was hard work and usually was done in the fall between Thanksgiving and Christmas. The colder temperatures helped the process of preserving the meat. The day began by boiling water in a large cast-iron pot over an open fire. The hog was stuck and bled when the water was thought to be capable of making the hair slip. Between 140 and 160 degrees depending on the weather and amount of hair. It was dangerous to handle a big hog and not get scalded yourself. The hot water made the hair slip, and a scraper was used to shave it down to the rind. The shaved hog carcass was then hoisted, and any remaining hair was shaved or singed with fire. Then a cut was made the length of the hog, and all the entrails were caught in a tub or something like it. The guts were taken and cleaned to be used for casings, and the organs were eaten fresh or ground with other parts into a sausage. The head was removed along with every scrap of meat, and the brain was eaten or used to make head cheese. The fat was slow cooked into lard, the rind into cracklings, and the small intestines into chitterlings. No parts were wasted, but the choice cuts were salted and put in the meat house to cure. When hog killing day was done, Jenny had literally brought home the bacon. Then she had to protect her meat from those who would take it. Reflection. King Solomon wrote about the example of the industrious ant. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways, and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. Proverbs 6:6-8. Jenny, Mart, and Billy all labored like the ant to have enough to feed them when food was scarce, and the cold of winter snow blew against their little cabin. Solomon also wrote, When it snows, she has no fear for her household. Proverbs 31:21. Endnote. In the early years of the war, the South's Bureau of Ordnance operated a number of saltpeter caves and niter works in Searcy County for the production of gunpowder. Saltpeter caves were located near the mouth of Short Creek, on the Buffalo near Cane Island, and on J.H. Love's farm on the south side of the Buffalo across from Saltpeter Cave Bluff. The niter works were possibly along Tomahawk Creek and Big 16 Creek, while the old Confederate mine and smelter was located on the western slope of Horn Mountain, near a high-grade lead mine. James Bratton, a Searcy Countian who had deserted from Camp Mazard near Fort Smith, was later detailed to the niter works along the Buffalo, and later recalled that the gunpowder produced was finished and then shipped to Arkadelphia. However, as the war progressed and communication with Little Rock grew more tenuous, the Niter and Mining Bureau withdrew from North Arkansas and relocated to the Niter Caves of West Texas.